On Thursday, we're going to be back in the computer lab. The main reason for that is not because of the new material, but it's because of the quiz. And so I haven't written the quiz yet, but in case I want to ask you a question that would use Excel, we'll be in there. All right? So if you want to be looking at what topics to refresh your memory on, you can go to the course schedule and see that it's been since class 29 since we had our last assessment. So it's going to be inclusive of today's class meeting all the way back to class 29. Okay, so homework 13 due on Sunday. That's the one that I've just put on the table there for you. The PDF is also posted on iLearn in case you lose the paper for that one. It's just some problems from the book. Any questions related to the schedule? I got a question earlier today in my fluid mechanics class about the format of the final exam. And my policy is usually the same, and that is that the final exam is comprehensive, but there's an emphasis on the material taken since the second midterm. And so what that means is that more of the points on a proportional basis, more of the points are coming from the more recent material, but there may be questions that are from the older material as well, although a smaller fraction of the points would be coming from the old material. And part of the reason for that is that both in fluid mechanics and in this course, the material is sort of naturally comprehensive. You know, I couldn't be giving you questions related to inflation without also including topics like interest and present value and so on. So it's hard to separate and write an exam that wouldn't be naturally cumulative. So just to have you thinking about that in the future. The one thing that you don't have to worry about in the future is your projects, right? Because those are already done and graded. So I noticed that when I gave you the handouts that had the numbered comments, not very many of those papers got taken. So you may have like a bunch of codes on your report and not know what those codes mean. And so if I haven't already posted that comment codes onto iLearn, then I'll do that. I think I already did, but I'll double check just in case you want to review your report and see what some of the comments were. You're talking about the final exam? The final exam is comprehensive for everything. Yeah, including the concepts and calculations. But there will be added emphasis on the newer material since the second midterm. Any other questions? Yes? I haven't decided yet. I'm not sure. You know, we had Excel questions on exam 1, exam 2, and all of the quizzes so far. So I feel like I've already given you a lot of Excel assessment. I love to ask Excel questions, and I hope you like to take Excel questions because it's a great tool, but I'm not sure about the final. When I make that decision, then I'll let you know. Good question. Any others? All right. Let me dim the lights. Has anybody been to the Classic Cars Museum in Sharjah? Just me and you? I've tried to go to all of the museums in Sharjah. There's just a couple more I still need to go to. I haven't yet been to the Maritime Museum, and I haven't been to the Art Museum. But besides that, I've been to all of them. If you go over to that Classic Cars Museum, it's further on Airport Road away from town on the left side. You'll see all sorts of vehicles like this. They actually have a very nice collection. And so this is a vehicle that's not even made anymore. The brand Hudson is long gone. And back then, a car was sort of like a second house, so much extra space. They didn't worry about things like fuel economy or safety, pesky little issues that seem to be at the forefront of our minds these days. It was mainly about, I guess, style and comfort, so much that they really put a lot of metal into these cars and had to have enormous gasoline-thirsty engines to get them to move at all. One of the most surprising things when you look back at old cars like this is the prices. You know, compared to the cost of cars today, you know, a full-size sedan that you can fit the whole family into would probably cost between 25 and 35,000 US dollars. But this price list, taken from the from the 1950s. This is some used cars that they have for sale, and then relatively newer ones as well. But you can see that the most expensive car on this list would be $1,400. So we've talked a lot this semester about how prices change over time. That's been one of the recurring themes of the course, is that over time costs go up. Why is that? Why do prices go up over time? What is it? No, inflation is the definition that prices are going up over time. So you can't say prices go up over time because of inflation, and inflation is defined as prices going up over time. Like, what's causing it? Okay, you say the value of money. What do you mean? Can you elaborate? The value of money is decreasing because prices are going up. So what's causing it, though? What's the underlying? What is it? Scarcity of resources. Can you elaborate what you mean by that and how it would cause inflation? Like, why would scarce resources make prices going up?
For example, if I have the raw materials that I put in the industry, that I have plenty of them, so the prices of the production would be low. But the raw materials that I put in the industry is less, so to get them you have to pay more money.
Okay.
So by then the production would be cost high.
So it sounds like the relationship you're describing is supply versus demand. That if there's a low supply of something, then the prices will go up, and so the demand would go down if the prices are going up. Well, I think at the heart of it, part of the reason why prices are becoming more expensive over time is because there's more people. And the reason for that is if there's more people, then there has to be more money in circulation. And if there's more money in circulation, then that greater number of dollars circulating through the economy, each one of them has less value because, you know, there's only a fixed amount of land on Earth. And so some things are staying constant. Some of the resources are staying constant. But then the amount of people and the money supply is increasing. So this is a graph that's the U.S. inflation over time. And I'm sure many of you have seen similar graphs for the UAE inflation. There were a lot of good figures that were posted into the reports as I was reading through those last week that had, it seemed like the UAE inflation, if we look at more recent years, it was increasing, and then around 2008 it crashed, and then it was going up a little bit more. So this was around 2005 to 2008 that the prices were really going crazy, and that was at the heart of construction in Dubai, where there was a lot of inflation. And so part of the reason why there was a lot of inflation in Dubai was, like I was saying before, more people. The population in Dubai was exploding during these years, and so there was more money in town because there was more people, and those more people were chasing a fixed number of apartments. When the number of people who wanted to buy cars was going up, then the price of cars went up. In fact, when I first arrived in 2005, I tried to go to Toyota, and they told me I had to make an appointment to buy a car. I had to book my car. I mean, I wasn't buying like a Lamborghini or a Ferrari where there's only, you know, making 100 of those per year. I just wanted to buy something ordinary, you know. They told me, well, we're taking bookings for delivery in 3 months. So I didn't wait. I just went somewhere else. Because there were so many people, everyone wanted a car, a place to live, and buying food. And so the prices of everything was going up. So what you look at this graph, what you'll notice is that in the United States, there were these really huge swings in prices, and things then stabilized. So it looks like the stabilization happened in around the 1960s. And just as a little bit of a history lesson, one of the reasons for that is that inflation jumps around a lot of times in sync with the health of the economy. And back in the UAE, if we look at this sort of typical drawing of inflation in the UAE, this inflation went down during a period that there was an economic crash in the UAE. Well, there was an economic crash everywhere in the world, but you know, it was felt in the UAE as much as any place else. when a lot of buildings ceased construction, a lot of projects had to be put on hold. And so in the United States, in the early half of the century, there was a lot more economic swings, but then they went off something called the gold standard. And prior to the 1960s, a dollar could be exchanged for a certain amount of gold. But after the 1960s, a dollar isn't necessarily linked to a fixed amount of gold. It was what's called a fiat currency. And what that means is that the government is worth money just because the government said so. And that's why money is valuable nowadays. Most currencies these days don't have a real tangible asset behind them in the way that it used to during the gold standard. And a lot of people say we should go back to the gold standard because they think that paper currency is worthless unless it has some tangible asset behind it. But the problem, if you look at this graph, this sort of tells you that there was a lot more economic volatility during the years that money was linked to gold. Because gold is a commodity and it's mined from the ground, and so sometimes there would be a lot of extra gold on the market just because the miners were doing well, and then that would change the value of the currency. Even though the economy itself may have already been in balance, but suddenly there would be a lot of extra gold, and so the value of people's money is going down because there's an oversupply of gold. So anyways, we don't need to talk too much about the gold standard, but I wanted to point out that inflation has been stabilizing in recent years. That is, governments and central banks get better at managing their money supply and are more instruments out there for measuring the health of the economy. In the early half of the century, the central banks weren't trying to be as responsive. They just let the economy do its thing, hands off. But nowadays, if the economy starts to slow down, sometimes the government will spend more on infrastructure, or will try and do more public hiring and public spending to stimulate the economy. Let's look at some terminology here. We've talked loosely about these things before, but let's get specific on these definitions. First of all, inflation is the increase in the amount of money needed to obtain the same goods or services. And so it's not just physical items that have inflation, like the cost of gasoline or the cost of food, but it's also services. Like having a haircut is more expensive these days than it was in the past because you have to provide enough money to the person who is providing the service so that then they can support themselves and buy the components of the service, the rent that they have to pay, the utilities they're paying, and so on. We can express the inflation on a percentage basis, and we're going to start calling that variable F. So inflation is going to be called F. And that is an annual value, a percentage in the change in the currency. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and I know a lot of you found this out on the project, is that it's hard to find bank accounts that can beat inflation. So actually the real value of your savings may be going down over time. If you don't beat inflation, then it's like you're losing money. And that's the case that I find myself in. Like my bank account right now back in the US pays 1% interest. But prices are going up faster than 1%. So it means the money that I have in the bank is growing, but it's becoming less valuable overall because the amount of money that I have is growing more slowly than prices are growing. So what this says is if your savings account interest rate equals the inflation rate, then you have no gain in purchasing power. You can think of it in other ways as well. You can say, if your savings account interest rate is greater than the inflation rate, then you do have a gain in purchasing power. Or if it's less than, then you'd have a decline in your purchasing power. All right. Now, in the context of inflation, we're going to assign the variable I to mean the real interest rate. Now, the real interest rate represents a gain in purchasing power. So it's where you have, you've removed the effects of inflation and you're only calculating if you can buy more things as a result of the interest that you've made or the profit that you've earned on a project. So I have an equation that I'll show you how to relate the real interest rate and the inflation rate so that we can isolate those two things. this inflation-adjusted interest rate takes them both into account. So it is the interest rate where you're accounting for inflation. So again, the real interest rate is when you have removed or not yet accounted for inflation. It's where you're trying to find out how much more stuff you can actually purchase with the real interest rate. But when you're accounting for F and I, then we have I sub F. That's the variable we're going to use to describe inflation-adjusted interest rate. So let's say, for instance, you are someplace that's experiencing inflation F. So the UAE, for example, maybe is experiencing 3.5% inflation. If you want your purchasing power to go up by I, then you have to make not only F, because F only gets you to keep up with inflation, and it's actually more than I as well. The formula for it is if you're going to purchase something in the present, if you want to relate the present and the future amount, then what you'll notice is that the factor for it is 1 plus I plus F and then I times F. So it's actually going to be a little bit more than inflation plus the real interest rate. It's inflation plus real interest rate plus those two factors multiplied together. And the reason for that here is you can see on the left side of these two expressions, this is saying we want to relate the future price of something and the present value of something. So 1 plus F is you're compounding the inflation rate, and then you also have to compound the interest rate, and so the two are multiplied together when you're compounding both of them simultaneously. So for the two components, there's part of it that's accounting for inflation and part of it that's accounting for the interest. So in other words, inflation-adjusted interest rate accounts for the real interest rate, inflation, and then multiplying the two together. Okay, so what we're going to do to get a feel for this is to start by working with in-class exercise 35, the first one, part 1. You've got the formula. Let me go back to the previous slide, and I'll put the formula back on the screen. But we have an item that's going to cost $5,000 now, and so it's going to be more costly in the future. We need to calculate what is the amount that's expected in 5 years, and also how much we should earn in order to be able to pay for it. Okay, so if you haven't already written it down, take this definition. I sub F equals I plus F plus I times F. You can write that onto the paper there. So here we have inflation. We want to find out how the cost is going to increase over time and what inflation-adjusted interest rate we need to earn. So there's 3 pieces we have to be keeping track of. The inflation as a percentage, the real interest rate as a percentage, and the inflation-adjusted interest rate as a percentage. So if we go back to these definitions, remember that what we're saying, the real interest rate is it represents your gain in purchasing power. And so you have to earn enough money so that you cover inflation, and then you want to earn even more above and beyond inflation. So that amount that takes both into account is I sub F. It's the inflation-adjusted interest rate. And the way that I've tried to illustrate it in this in-class exercise is by saying, all right, so you expect with the F, you can predict what the future price will be. If it costs $5,000 now, and prices are going up 4% per year, then it compounds, and so that the future price would be 6,083. And that's a pretty big increase in price, even when 4% is relatively low inflation, right? That's how compounding works, is it just continues to accumulate. So even though nowadays in the UAE our inflation is pretty low, if you give it enough time, prices will really be affected a lot. Okay, so in part B, we're trying to find out if we can earn a real interest rate, so that means I. If I is 10%, then the inflation adjusted interest rate has to also cover not only the 10%, but also the inflation, and then this last term, I times F. And this part handles the compounding effect of it. And so it should be 14.4% is what you would want your account to earn. And if you can go find an account that is paying 14.4%, what that means is that you'll have enough to cover inflation, and then you'll also have enough so that your real purchasing power is going up at a rate of 10%. So that means you're actually at an advantage by keeping the money in the bank, because the amount is growing faster than inflation is. Any questions so far with part A and part B? All right, so then the last thing is just trying to find out how much money you'd need to put in the bank. Now, look at this one. P equals F times 1 divided by, and then we have the whole thing. So what I've done in my solution is I'm saying I sub F is this. And so let me raise the screen a little bit. I'm just saying you can substitute I sub F for all of these. So 1 plus I sub F to the n power. So that gives you the relationship between present and future. And so since we're accounting for everything, we're counting for how much gain in purchasing power we get from the account, and also the changing prices of the account over time. So that tells us how much we need to put into the bank now, because not only are prices going up, but the purchasing power of our money is going up because we have exceeded the inflation based on what the account is paying. So you need to deposit this much now to be able to buy the item in the future. Gin. Not really. I hear the gin are strong in Ras Al Khaimah. Is that true? There's a city up there? Yeah. Yeah. All right. So any questions from the example? All right. So this next one, let's look at airplanes. And I actually looked up the price of an Airbus 380. They cost a cool $340 million. Pretty expensive plane. So let's say, for instance, that the cost is increasing at 9% per year. So let's find out how many years it's going to take until the price is 500 million. And so with this, the value that we have, 9%, that's F. So F is 9%, and we're going to use the future value is the present value 1 plus F to the n. And what we're trying to solve for here is n. And the hint I give you on the paper is that you can use the log function to try and solve that. Maybe it will help you if you remember that using the log function can get something out of the exponent. All right, so let me give you some time to work on that one. Now for this one, we don't round it up to round it down to 4 years or up to 5 years, because in a real economy, prices are continuously changing. It's not like the price changes once per year. In fact, the only thing that changes like in discrete amounts, it's kind of an unusual thing, is the fact that the fuel price is adjusted once per month. In a lot of places, you go to a filling station and the fuel price may be changing more than one time per day. You drive past a station in the morning and it's one price, and you're driving back in the evening and it may be a different one. So here, it's okay for us to express the answer in decimal terms, because it may actually be in partial years that the price adjustments are occurring for the cost of aircraft. All right, let's talk about one more thing today. Let's talk about the opposite of inflation. This is a picture of an old computer. This is an IBM compatible computer. I should have made the image a little bit larger. Let me expand it here so that you can see in all its beauty the many features that are provided on these old computers. Now this was the computer of a rich person, because it had 2 disk drives here, you can see. Whoever had this computer was feeling very fancy, because it allowed you to copy a program from one disk to another. And the more common people only had 1 disk drive. And do you know what the disks would look like? Have you seen the floppy disks? Yeah, they were 5.25 inches, and they would hold 1.4 megabytes on the floppy, and you had to flip it over if you wanted to do that. It wasn't until much later that they had disk drives that would read the top and the bottom. So sometimes your computer would tell you, flip it over, and you'd have to put it in again, and it would read the other side of the disk. And so if it's a double-sided disk, then you have 1 megabyte. And so you would have usually on one disk the operating system, and then the other disk is where you save your files. But if you had a cheap computer, then you had to put in your operating system, it would read it, and you'd take the disk out and then put in the other disk. It was very funny. The screens here are only one color. It's black and green usually. And so these computers were really basic. Their speed, you talk about megahertz and gigahertz and everything. I had one like this, and it had a button on the front, and it actually said on the button, it said turbo. And if you pushed the turbo button, it would be operating at 8 megahertz. So that was the speed of the processor. If the turbo button wasn't pushed, then it was something like 4.5 megahertz. So I usually left the turbo on, because I'm a speed freak, right? So I like fast computers. So the reason why I am showing you this picture is because it fits in very nicely with the idea of deflation. My dad bought this, not this computer, but one very similar to it. He purchased it in 1987 and paid more than $2,000. And so $2,000 for a computer is a lot today, but it was really a lot back in 1987. Because back in 1987, just to give you an example, you could buy a car for $8,000. And so 1/4 of the price of a car. So think about a car nowadays, how much that would cost. A new car would maybe cost 100,000 dirhams, right? So 1/4 of the cost of that would be 25,000 dirhams for a computer. So that's what this computer did, and it didn't surf the internet. Like I already said, it only had one color on the screen, so it wasn't very good for games. It's not virtual reality, that's for sure. The only thing it really did was you could type a paper on it. It was a word processor. If you knew how to use a spreadsheet, then you could do a spreadsheet. But the spreadsheets back then were very difficult to use because there's no mouse. That's another thing that this computer doesn't have, is it doesn't have a graphical user interface. It's just text only. And so you're typing, and it's not like you click and drag icons. That didn't exist back then. It was DOS was the operating system. So the price of computers has gone down a lot, both in real terms and especially in inflation-adjusted terms. Because if you think about what your computer can do and how little you pay for it compared to this. Like, you know, everyone's phone, even if it's the worst phone in the UAE, is more powerful than that. Like, even if it's just a Nokia, like, it's going to be way faster and more powerful than these old computers. And so deflation is described as a decrease in prices over time. So think about, why would prices go down? Part of the reason why prices can go down is because money is becoming more valuable. But there's actually a cycle. And so often deflation is seen when the economy is doing poorly, where very temporarily the inflation rate goes below zero. What that means is that so few people are buying things that the sellers are giving sales and discounts. And so if a car seller has to give a discount to attract new business, that means that now the seller is selling the item for less than they did last year. And that, if that continues for very long, it has kind of what's called a deflationary spiral. So think of it this way. Prices are going down because, you know, the sellers have to sell. So they're trying to stimulate demand by decreasing the prices. Now, we've already seen that the way that you can get people to buy your items, right, we have a curve like this. And so this is the demand, which is increasing on the horizontal axis. And then this is the revenue. So if you're selling a lot of items, but you're doing it cheaply, then you may be selling at a loss. So here was our relationship of cost, you know, the fixed costs and the variable costs. So if you're not able to cover your costs, then you are losing money, and that leads to debt defaults. So by debt defaults, that means maybe your business took out a loan to purchase equipment, and now it can't pay for that equipment anymore. So now the bank has a tractor that it doesn't need. Or maybe you just fly away and leave the country. There were people who would park their car at the airport back in 2008. It was a real problem. Like, the airport parking lots were full of, you know, really nice cars that people couldn't afford anymore, and they just flew home and left the Gulf forever. And so that's a debt default, and if there's enough of them, then companies and banks can go bankrupt. And if companies and banks are going bankrupt, then their employees suffer as well. Because a company that isn't making any revenue and they stop operations, they fire all of their employees. So now people have less money to spend, and so that kills the demand. And so then the companies who are still in business have to lower their prices even more. So it turns into a cycle, and people are really scared of deflation. You know, inflation, increasing prices, is scary enough. But what governments are really terrified of is deflation, because it's this cycle of prices going down and wages going down. And another factor that sort of plays into it is how anxious are you to buy something when you know in 1 week it will be cheaper? So people, even if they do have money, even the people who didn't get laid off and aren't suffering, people who still have a job and still have money, they delay the purchase because they know that why should they spend the money now if the money becomes more valuable in the future? You should hold on to it. You shouldn't get rid of the money now. You should keep it because it will be even more valuable in the future when the prices are lower. So think about, sometimes you're tempted not to buy a smartphone because the new model is coming out. Or you're tempted not to buy a computer because you know that in 6 months the computer will be even cheaper. It's okay for 1 or 2 products in the economy to be deflating, but when everything is deflating, then it can be really stressful for everyone in the economy and can do a lot of damage. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the idea of deflation. Since we talk so much about inflation, it's natural to ask what's the opposite of that. That's all for today, so let's take one final look at these announcements. On Thursday, we'll be in the computer lab for the quiz. And get an early start on the homework because it will be due on Sunday. So I'll see you on Thursday.